My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. Our guest is Patrick Crowley. Mr. Crowley is the Secretary-Treasurer of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO Labor Union, and he was formerly the Chief Lobbyist for the NEA-RI Teachers Union. Welcome to State of the State.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Our topic this evening is some of the pending legislation in this session of the General Assembly and organized labor's perspective on it. First, many of the candidates for public office, mainly Democrats who come on this program, all claim that they want to represent the working family or middle class or average Rhode Islanders on Smith Hill to offset the lobbyists for special interests in big business. To any observer of the political scene, it is obvious that labor unions, especially teachers, firefighters, construction workers, Council 94, are the most potent lobbying force in the state. Mr. Crowley, is that an overstatement? Is there another political force with greater clout than the union?
Oh, I think there's plenty of people that would be able to compete for that title. I mean, it's true, we do have a good deal of influence at the State House and in other corridors of power in Rhode Island. But I think that's more a testament to the membership that we have. I mean, our members are very active at the ground level, at the shop floor level, and in their communities. And I think our influence at the State House is a testament to their power as working people to advocate for their positions.
Very good. Let's look at some of the specific bills. Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea, who's running for governor, and some Liberal representatives like Jason Knight, Catherine Kazarian, and Senator Don Ewer are supporting bills that would ostensibly make voting easier. In the last election, Gorbea suspended the requirement that mail-in ballots be witnessed by two people who sign and print their names or a notary public, which essentially makes it a sworn affidavit. When her decree was challenged in court, Democrat colleague Attorney General Peter Nerona failed to show up to represent the state, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Now, Secretary Gorbea argued in a recent committee that the requirement is superfluous because the Board of Election doesn't do anything to authenticate those signatures. She said the voter's signature is verified by a four-tier process whereby they are compared to signatures on file from past elections or DMV records, which seems to be somewhat contradictory. On one hand, the Board of Election doesn't, and on the other hand, they have a four-tier process. So I guess the question I would have is, do we really believe that people at the Board of Election use a four-tier process to verify every signature on a mail-in ballot?
Yes, so luckily I was at the State House last week when there was testimony from Secretary Gorbea and along with some of the staff and leadership in the Board of Elections. And they outlined it very specifically about how the process works. And it's not just that the two signatures or the notary on the mail ballot are superfluous. They're actually even less secure. I mean, it gives a false sense of security that what you're doing is safer or legal. The real security is the individual voter's signature on the ballot and on the envelope, because that's what the Board of Elections has access to that they can verify. So if we're going to be in a place where we want to encourage more voting and make it easier, we're not making it less safe by not requiring these things. In fact, we're probably increasing the security while we're making it easier.
So another bill would allow, the overall thing is called the Fairness in Voting Act or something, but several bills are involved. Yes. And another one would allow voters to get a mail-in ballot without citing a reason, and they want to change the name from emergency voting to early voting. Now, Mr. Crowley, you testified that working people have difficulty taking time off to vote because gone are the days when people work the 9-to-5 shift. Now, I've been the moderator or clerk at several polling places for many years. The polls in Rhode Island are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., which really leaves plenty of time for working class people to vote. And in fact, my experience is that between 6:30 and 8 o'clock, there are very few ballots cast. There are a few that come through the door. Now, do you really think that having polls open 13 hours on election day creates a problem for working people?
No, I just don't think it's the most expeditious use of our time. You know, I think the reality is, especially in the United States, that having Election Day on a Tuesday is an anachronism from the days when we moved around our roads and bridges with horses and shop carts. And it was the whole idea of you needed to have time to get from the farm to town hall to cast your ballot. And that was a day-long experience. But that was 300 years ago. So the idea that we only have to have elections on one day, when the reality is we have campaigns that last for months, if not years. If it encourages more people to participate, then give people the opportunity to vote when it's convenient for them. It's not going to change the outcomes. It's still secure. It's still safe. But if we really want to have all of the voices of Rhode Islanders heard, let's make sure that this process is a little bit more 21st century based.
What about just moving Election Day to a Saturday or a Sunday?
That's also a very good idea, but I still think that you would need the opportunity to have people, you know, give a no-excuse mail ballot so that they can vote when it's convenient, whether it's because they have to work on Election Day, whether or not they have to take care of a loved one on Election Day, or whether Election Day is a day that they're just not in town. I think we really, it's this idea of making sure that the electoral process is as simple for the majority of voters to participate in.
Another bill would require that nursing home residents automatically receive mail-in ballot applications and allow voters to apply for one online is also on the table. Am I being skeptical when I wonder if a person in a dementia unit of a nursing home is really the voter casting a ballot, or did someone on the staff or nursing home pick it up and vote for them? Or in fact, even online requests could be from a family member or someone other than the actual voter asking for it. Is this simply an invitation to what's known as ballot harvesting?
No, it's not. And I think the burden is on the people who believe that to prove the case, because the evidence shows the contrary. The actual existence of voter fraud is virtually non-existent, but when it does happen, it's so minor and insignificant to votes that this idea that there's widespread voter fraud, I actually think is a way for people that are uncomfortable with the voting outcomes to try to justify why they lost.
Rhode Island is one of the states, as you know, that requires a voter ID to vote, which you obviously don't have to do if you're going to be given a mail-in application. That law was passed in Rhode Island because Representative Anastasia Williams and former Senator Harold Metz, both of whom were black, went to the polling place and were told they had already voted, which is pretty clear evidence of, if you want to call it voter fraud or something was amiss. They were the two sponsors, and that is why that law is on the books in Rhode Island. So if we have a law that says you have to present a ID credential, doesn't have to be a driver's license, can be other things. How does that work in a mail-in or drop box situation? Well,
it's the same. It would be the same as voting in person. So when you're voting in person, you have to present your ID, and that's your validation. But if my signature is validated at the same time through the mail-in process, there's a security check in place. So that's why I think the idea of having that voter ID for a mail-in ballot, that's when it would be superfluous, because the Board of Elections is not checking your picture. The Board of Elections is checking your signature. And if your signature is on the mail ballot, they have access to your signature. That's the security check on it. And I think there's a big difference between human error and voter fraud. People make mistakes. And even if did I vote in the wrong day? Did I vote for the wrong party? Did I vote the wrong ballot? Mistakes happen. It's the intent that's really crucial. Because if I'm going to commit a crime like voter fraud, I have to have the intent to do it. So if I'm going to take your ballot, Dick, and write your name in, I'm deliberately committing a crime. The instances of that are so few and far between that it's an immeasurable level of concern.
But if somebody is physically at a polling place and they make a mistake, they can request the clerk or the moderator to issue a new ballot. The one that they made a mistake on is marked void and put in a separate envelope so it can be accounted for. If they make a mistake on a mail-in ballot or a drop box, there's no recourse at that point.
Oh, exactly. That's why I think when it comes to having those options, those are important options, because the idea of if I make a mistake at my the ballot. But it's also, if I've come to show up to vote and someone, the clerk's office says to me, sorry, Mr. Crowley, your vote has already been cast, I can still vote. They'll just put my ballot into provisional ballot, and then they'll sort out the differences.
Right. One more question that it seems that the direction is to create an election season rather than an election day, which is called for in both the federal and state constitutions. In fact, that's why they capitalized the E and the D. So let me ask this question. This is hypothetical. In November 2020, if Joe Biden had another brain aneurysm or Donald Trump had a heart attack after I cast my ballot, what would happen then? What would happen to my vote? What happens?
Well, it would be the same in any election. I mean, first, I think the characterization of President Biden having another aneurysm isn't really fair to
Well,
the
he
president.
had two. He's had, that's...
Right, but I think the implication there is that somehow the president, is incapable of doing his job. So
not my intent.
Then good. I'm glad we cleared that up.
Donald Trump hasn't had a heart attack either, but he does eat a lot of Big Macs and fries, right?
Yeah, and he also commits a lot of crimes, but that's a different story.
We're not going to go into that.
So, I mean, it would be the same in any circumstance. Human beings sometimes, die unexpectedly. So it wouldn't matter if it was Joe Biden, Donald Trump, or a candidate to be named later. If I go in and I vote and someone passes away, same thing could happen on Election Day. Mm-hmm. So I understand where the concern is coming from. I just don't think that it holds up under the scrutiny of the evidence.
Okay. Let's move on to another topic. There's another push this year to issue driver's licenses to people who came here illegally or who have overstayed their visas. In either case, they're not supposed to be working. Yet I recall former Governor Link Chafee making the argument when this was first floated that they need to drive to get to their jobs. It seems to me that organized labor should be concerned that these undocumented workers, many of whom are paid under the table or below minimum wage in a lot of cases, they're taking jobs away from union members. Does the AFL-CIO support these driver's licenses for illegal persons, residents?
Well, I mean, first let's be clear that the concern isn't about whether or not undocumented people are going to be able to drive to work safely or have some kind of document so that if they get into an accident or need to contact the police, that they're not immediately under suspicion for not having a driver's license. So that's not the concern. The concern is how workers, especially undocumented workers, are exploited in the economy by being paid substandard wages, and also by employers engaging in what's called wage theft, where employers will hire a person to do a job, not pay them, pocket the money themselves, and then when a worker doesn't have the, is undocumented, can't go to the police, can't go to the attorney general, they have no recourse. Yeah. That's the concern that people should be having. Whether or not a person is having a driver's license, I think it would be in the best interest of the state of Rhode Island to make sure that they do, because in order to get a driver's license, I'm going to have to pass a driving test, or at least a written test. So I'm going to have to demonstrate that I have at least some kind of understanding of the rules of the road. If I'm going to have a driver's license and I get pulled over, that police officer is going to know that at least there's some record of my existence so that he or she can do that check on their machine in their car to know that whether or not the person they're going to confront is potentially dangerous. Or if they're perfectly safe and fine, they just might have committed a traffic violation. I think it's in everyone's best interest to make sure that that everyone that's driving has some kind of license, so that if I'm in an accident with someone who's undocumented, but at least they have a license, at least now I have a process to go through. And I just think it's better for our economy if people don't feel like they have to live in the shadows.
Mm-hmm. A very controversial topic, as you know, right now is Rhode Islanders are concerned about the so-called $3,000 COVID bonuses, which is, maybe a mischaracterization, but that's the way it's viewed. And they're being awarded to state employees. And initially, these bonuses were to reward people for getting vaxxed, and then they were going to use them to encourage people to get the jab, as it's called. And then it was floated around as a bonus for all unionized state workers as a reward for working through the pandemic. And this is all taking place while you were negotiating, Council 94, I think, was negotiating a new contract. The judicial branch came out and said, oh, we're going to give everybody bonuses including judges. And Governor McKee announced that the new contract with state troopers included bonuses. So it seems to me that there's something missing here. Should unionized state workers be awarded COVID bonuses while those who kept the economy moving, bank tellers, drivers, truck drivers, supermarket clerks, ambulance drivers, they get to keep their job and work, and they're getting paychecks. But the state workers are being given bonuses because they too were collecting paychecks. Does that make sense?
No, and I think the way you've characterized it is part of the problem.
Okay.
That the news media in the state did an incredible disservice to the people who work for the state of Rhode Island. Their characterizations of this entire process have been atrocious, quite frankly. I mean, borderline malpractice when it comes to reporting. You know, as someone who actually was negotiating these bonuses at the table, I think there's a couple of things that we need to make clear. First, it's not just Council 94 that represents state workers, though they do an admirable job and they represent their members very well. There's actually 14 or 15, depending on how you count it, unions that have collective bargaining agreements with the state. And all of those unions were bargaining simultaneously. Council 94 bargains as their coalition because they represent the most individual union members, but the other 13 unions bargain as a collective organization known as the coalition with the state. And we bargain at the same time as Council 94. And when these bonuses were first presented to us as a counter proposal to us, asking for more money and salary and benefits, I think the administration made a valid argument to us. They said, listen, we're not in a position to give you the raises that you want and that we think you deserve, because we just don't know what the economy is going to look like a year from now, 2 years from now. So while while the unions were advocating for, we want 4%, we want 5%, we want a decent raise to cover our members' hard work during the pandemic, the state made a reasonable argument that said, we can't meet you all the way, but let's meet halfway. So this idea of a bonus was discussed between the parties. And it was always a tripartite kind of system. It was always about, we want to reward the people who got their COVID vaccine and did it on time. We want to retain people because the state is losing a number of people because of all the benefit changes that we've had over the last 10 years. I mean, our pension changes means that people don't stay as long as they used to. The cost of health insurance is right, and a lot of our members can make more money in the private sector, and the benefits don't match up the way they used to. So the state is having a difficulty retaining people. And third, it was a hedge against the inflation. So that we know inflation is bubbling up now, even though I really think it's corporate profit taking and not actually cost increasing, but that's a whole other conversation. So there needed to be some recognition that the value of a worker's paycheck wasn't going to go as far as it might have otherwise. That was the reason for the bonuses, all three of those reasons combined. And I think it was really unfair the way it was characterized by some people in the news media, but typically those people have an axe to grind against organized labor anyway. But to your larger point, I mean, the members that I represent working in state service worked above and beyond like so many working people in the state. It wasn't that they had an easier job, their job was harder. So for example, one of the groups that I personally represented for a number of years are the professional staff at the Rhode Island Department of Health. I mean, these people immediately went into emergency management mode and were working 7 days a week, 12, 16 hours a day, not all remote, doing some of the more dangerous jobs within the COVID response team. We have a number of people that work in the state nursing homes, the state hospitals, the fire service, the police and fire services across the state. All of our members went above and beyond, many of them sacrificing their time away from their family, dealing with all of the stress. Many of my members in state service really do work behind the scenes. The people that we don't see until something goes wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think not only do they deserve it, they deserve more.
So when the people that were working, as you say, 7 days a week, they're presumably being paid overtime, right?
Not all of them.
Okay, but
no.
some were.
Some were,
okay.
Sure.
And you said that it's like almost a two-tier bargaining system. Council 94 representing the most, the other 13 bargaining units or unions, they're negotiating at the same time for 13 other contracts, right?
Correct.
So in effect, the contract that Council 94 agrees to, generally the other 13 will go along with, right?
When it comes to the wages and benefits, sure, but you got to remember that the state workforce is an incredibly diverse number of people. We represent everyone from cooks, helpers at the Veterans Home to molecular biologists that work at some of the colleges and at the Department of Health. So it's this huge range of people that work, and all of their work rules are a little bit different. The folks that work at the Department of Transportation are going to have different overtime setups than the people that work at the DMV. Mm-hmm. But we all have the same benefit package, and generally speaking, the wage increases are usually the same, and that's how that process plays out.
I heard just as maybe an anecdote, I did hear a caller to a local radio talk show when this whole thing was being bandied about in the media, and the caller identified himself as a state worker, and he said, and I'm going to use the word he used, he was entitled to a bonus because he worked at a state college and he had to work while the teachers and faculty could work from home. That kind of put me in a difficult frame of mind because I said, you're being allowed to work, you're doing the job you agreed to do, but because somebody else in the same company or department goes home to work from home, you have to work. You're not entitled to the bonus. You may feel that you earned it, but this idea of entitlement seems to be a bit of an overreach.
Yeah, generally speaking, I think it's a bad idea to take news from talk radio with any level of seriousness. There's a number of good people that work in that field, but some of them really twist the truth a lot. So I think really what would a better way to get a sense of what state workers are feeling is really spend some time with them. One of the benefits of my job is I get to spend a lot of time with working class people across all types of industries. And the things that they tell me about their jobs and their workplace, whether they're union or not, are really, you would think sometimes we're back in the 18th century with sweatshops, the way working people are treated. And this is in a state like Rhode Island where we have some pretty strong laws. That's why the labor movement fights every single day. And I think it's more important to get, a caller to an anonymous caller to a talk radio show, it might not be the best bellwether.
Okay, fair point. The Providence Journal conducted a survey of the 4 Democrat candidates who are challenging Governor McKee. At that time, a Republican candidate had not announced for the office. They asked about increasing the minimum wage. The progressive candidate, Matt Brown, said it should be raised to $19 an hour and include tipped workers like bartenders and hairdressers and so forth. The somewhat left-leaning Luis Daniel Munoz, who's been on this program a couple of times, said that $19 is not enough and we need a livable wage through an undefined supplemental wage program, whatever that is. Now, first of all, does your union believe the minimum hourly wage, what should it be? It's already moving up to $15 an hour. Do you have a position on what the hourly wage minimum should be?
Yeah, so our position is that we're supporting the law that was signed into existence by Governor Raimondo a few years ago that it moved the progression to the $15 an hour. And we think that once we get there, then we can continue the conversation about where the wage goes. Because it's not just about the minimum wage, nor is it just about the tipped minimum wage, which also should increase. There are a number of people that are excluded from even the minimum wage, and I'll give you a good example. Domestic workers are not covered by the minimum wage laws in the state. Not that there's a lot of maids and butlers anymore, but believe it or not, there are. Au pairs and childcare workers in the house, they're exempt from the minimum wage. And this is really a legacy of the federal government's racism back in the 1930s, because they were explicitly excluded from minimum wage laws. Because why? Because most of the people doing this work were African American. It's the same reason why farm workers are still to this day excluded from minimum wage laws, because most of them were brown-skinned people. So when we look at the nature of minimum wage laws, we need to look at it in the totality of who's represented in the various classes of employees and figure out how we get rid of the structural racism that still exists when it comes to how we pay working people.
As far as farm workers, as an aside, I was born and raised in the Connecticut Valley, so-called Tobacco Valley. Mm-hmm. And my first job was on a tobacco farm, 14 years of age, and I got paid less than my black and people, Puerto Rican counterparts. Mm-hmm. But your point is well taken. There's always this idea, too, of a living wage, but I don't even know, how much is a living wage? I mean, your labor union obviously negotiates, and you're looking at what the cost of living is going to be. What is a living wage supposed to be?
So from our point of view, a living wage is a wage where it's a family-sustaining wage. So it could pay for the basics of what you need and a little bit extra to put aside so that you can entertain with your family and save for retirement. And that's going to be different in different circumstances for sure, right? But it's this idea that you don't need, you shouldn't have to work more than a 40-hour job to live your life in a productive way. And if you want to, great. There's always overtime, there's always second jobs and always third jobs, but it shouldn't be the case that in the United States in the 21st century, in a state like Rhode Island, that people are just getting by in the bare minimum while working 40, 50, 60 hours a week. So we really need to make sure, one of the reasons why we're so, advocate to organize more workers, because union workers do make more money, is that we got to get back to that idea of a family-sustaining wage. And that's what a living wage is for us.
Okay, but doesn't that run the risk of almost a two-tier system? And for example, if you have a worker who's a single mother with 3 or 4 kids who's coming in and working at a job, and then another woman comes in who happens to have 2 children, and she's married to a husband who has a very well-paying job. I mean, those 2 circumstances are totally different. Doesn't that put the employer in a position of saying, I've got to pay the single mother more, so that because her living wage should be higher than the woman who has the advantage of a spouse that's got a lot of money? I mean,
no,
how does that work?
I think how it should really work is the 2 tiers in this country are the people that do the work and then the people that run the companies. The CEO pay is an extraordinary outgrowth of some bad policy decisions from the 1980s and the Reagan era. At the start of the 1980s, the differential between what a working person made and what the average CEO made was something around 27 to 1. Now it's almost 500 to 1. And that's just obscene. So really, the 2 tiers in this country are not one working class person versus another working class person. They really are those that work and those that take all of the money for our labor.
But if someone's working for a private enterprise, that enterprise should be free to pay them whatever they think they should be paid. I'm not talking about CFOs or CEOs or presidents. I'm talking about, let's look at sports. Look at the contracts that are being given out to quarterbacks as opposed to an offensive lineman or someone who's a special teams player. There's differences there. Nobody complains that the quarterbacks are the highest paid, generally the highest paid player on the team.
Except the linemen.
Well, except the linemen. Good
right,
point.
no,
yeah.
right, so they complain.
Yeah.
And so I think that the actual example needs to be that we look at, how working class people are treated and how do we rein in CEO pay and make sure that working people get more of what they deserve.
Okay, got 1 minute left. Is there any topic or bill that we haven't talked about that you feel is really important to the union?
Yeah, I mentioned it a little bit earlier. It's this idea of making wage theft a felony. So right now, if a boss or an employer steals, doesn't pay a worker, just literally doesn't give them their paycheck, it's not a felony. So if I break into your house, Dick, and I steal your $1,500 TV, chances are I'm going to go to jail because I'm committing a felony. But if you work for me and I just don't pay you, I haven't committed a felony, it's just a misdemeanor. So I can get away with stealing tens of thousands of dollars, and it happens so often. We just released a report about how prevalent it is in the state, and we really need to make wage theft a felony to help stop that.
Seems to be sensible, and we want to thank you and thank our audience for joining us during this political season. There's many more bills that I have here for notes, and perhaps after this legislative session winds up, you can come back on and we can review some of the bills that did pass and talk about some that were held for future study.
Happy to do it.
Thank you for joining us on State of the State.